Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Meme Team podcast, where we dissect the marketing strategies behind viral cultural moments. I'm Sonia Baschez, and this week I'm welcoming back Yury Molodtsov, partner at MA Family, who led PR campaigns for companies like JetBrains, Miro, and Flipper Zero. It's good to have you back. Welcome back, Yury.
Thank you. Great to be here again.
Awesome. So I want to talk about this week and last week, pretty much since Project Hail Mary came out, that space is in right now. People kind of, there's the movie that came out, but the big thing happening is that Artemis 2 is launching to the moon this week, tomorrow, actually, on Wednesday.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. True. I shouldn't assume. But I kind of want to talk about the brand case for optimism. People want the advancement of like human technology and human ingenuity. So Project Hail Mary opened March 20th, and this second weekend was one of the biggest in recent box office history. It reached 54.5 million and domestically in week 2, which is only a 32% drop from the 80.5 million opening, which is higher than most movies that on their second week. It's already at 164 million domestic and 300 million global, making it Amazon MGM's biggest movie ever and Ryan Gosling's biggest lead role film to date. The film is relentlessly optimistic about space. You have the school teacher that goes up to, save the planet, save the sun, makes an alien friend named Rocky. And it's basically the opposite of doom and gloom. The critics love it, audiences love it, and it shows no signs of stopping. I'm actually going to go see it tomorrow. I'm super excited.
No, you still haven't. It's a great movie.
Yeah, the perks of having children. You got to kind of space things out a little bit more. But we're finally going tomorrow. We're going to the Chinese theater here in LA, which is the biggest IMAX screen. So I'm super excited about that. Yeah. And then the other big thing is that, NASA is launching Artemis 2, the first crewed mission to the moon since 1972. 4 astronauts will fly around the moon. I did see this on Twitter that a mom of like a space kid, is telling people it's not actually landing on the moon. It's just going around the moon. But the point is that it's still going to be very cool. People want to have this like excitement around, something because so many other things are sucking so much. And I think we're seeing it, I think for the first time in a really long time, space as like an adventure, right? As opposed to a complete threat, which is like you have, the alien invasion movies or like, asteroid horror. So it's not a bleak metaphor for space. It's, one of the times that we're seeing space as an adventure, as like you're solving a problem, you're, bringing the best of humanity together, everybody together, right? To fix this problem. So Yury, I know you've seen this. You saw the movie. Have you read the book? What do you think?
Yeah, I read the book. I saw the movie. I think the movie is great. I think I still prefer The Martian a little bit more, but they're both fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Andy Weir now has 2 books that's been turned into movies. He also has a third one that he wrote between them. Do you know how it's called?
Artemis.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, Artemis. That's funny. I didn't like that one very much. But they say that they're trying to make it into a TV show, right?
I don't know actually, but I think it's like it probably has
that.
slightly smaller like scores, but it's just like I like how it rhymes.
Yeah.
I mean, I liked a lot of what's been like happening around Hail Mary, and it's just so wholesome and like positive. And Ryan Gosling said this curious phrase that it's sort of like it's not the audience's job to save the movies; it's the Hollywood's job to actually make great movies. And I mean, it's definitely nice to sort of like hear people being rewarded for their efforts because it's objectively a very cool movie, and you should all go and see it.
Yeah, the phrase that stuck out to me on his press tour was saying that he wanted to make a movie for his kids where he's talking about, optimism of like the future, right? Where it's like we'll all come together and we'll fix it instead of have things be horrible all the time. Like there is a way for all of us to come together and create a better future. And I thought that, that rang, particularly true for me as well with like my kids, how I think about it's like, I want things to be better for them. And space is one of those things, right? Like we should be able to explore and like, be out there and, figure out what else is out there. That was one thing. And then the other thing was a very popular account that posts like the IMAX, photos of like what it looks like to see the movie. And it was just very much, this whole everybody coming together to be very like anti-AI, like creating these types of images and then showing how visual effects can still be made by humans that are superior to what, AI is creating. And just showing like the work behind it, which I thought was like really cool because it's like, everybody's talking about AI, right? I mean, every so often there's some like, tweet that goes viral about like, oh, the Matrix costs like $100 million to like make, but we made this same scene for like, $10 or whatever. And it's like, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. So the fact that like we saw those photos and then it, the team behind it started dropping like behind the scenes photos or like videos showing how they kind of put together all like the visual effects to see, so we see it all come together. And I thought that was really cool because I really feel we're in at a time where it's like we want to see real craftsmanship and how it all kind of comes together a little bit, more than we have in a while. And maybe this is just because we don't really get, behind the scenes content anymore with like, DVDs and stuff. I mean, I remember watching that growing up. I particularly remember like the Matrix one, kind of seeing like the 3D effects and everything come to life, and like Lord of the Rings, how all of that, all the practical effects were like made. But we don't really get to see that anymore. And I think last year when Ryan Coogler was talking about, the different screens for like Kodak video, everybody started realizing, yeah, actually this is pretty cool. We should use this more as like the marketing that we're, using for to promote movies. And with a movie of this scale on something that like requires this much, visual effects, it's amazing to see. And I think this is also kind of a prelude to the other movies that we're getting this year with, the Odyssey from Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 3, which are obviously going to also be spectacles. And I think it's also bringing to the fore how much people actually enjoy going to the movies, and not just staying at home and watching Netflix.
Yeah, and like both of the movies that you mentioned, and obviously like Hail Mary, they're also sort of like filmed for IMAX essentially. And I've had this idea that IMAX is basically a super brand because they're superimposing their own brand onto other brands, like movies, like directors everywhere. And it's sort of like these people are actually happy that they're doing this because IMAX is a sign of quality. It's like, why all of these like X accounts are posting these like photos? Oh, like look at these, like the tallest screen on the world or so, because like this is when you actually notice a difference from like your 55-inch TV with Netflix.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Yeah, no, I've seen kind of the rise of IMAX a little bit more. I happen to live in one of the cities that has IMAX, and I guess I never really thought about, because before that I lived in San Francisco, which also has it, and then New York, which has it. So I guess I'd never really thought about the fact that there are places in this country that don't have IMAX theaters that they can go to. But that's one of the things that IMAX has said they're trying to do this year, is to build more IMAX theaters. So I do wonder how that is going to affect the rates of, people going to the movies, because it's, that is, you're right. Like that's the starkest difference between seeing it on your TV at home and then going to the movie. I also think it has something to do with seeing it with a whole group of people that are just as excited as you are to like watch the movie, and then have those like conversations afterward. We have such a dearth of community that like, if this is one thing that everybody's talking about, that ever elusive monoculture, right? It's like something that everybody can talk about and have an opinion about. And that's kind of been great, because most of the commentary that I've seen about Project Hail Mary has all been positive, right? I haven't really seen too much negative stuff come out. Okay. The other thing about the space program that I wanted to notice also, like you noticed that the book name, the Artemis program is also a branding case study. The name isn't random. They named it after Artemis, Apollo's sister, which was the previous, iteration of the moon of the rockets that went to the moon. Um, and she's
54 years ago.
also I know, right? Yes, I know. That's so dumb. It's one of those things like it should have been, happening. And it's funny because there's so many more like TV shows now that like talk about being out in space, right? I mean, what for all mankind, right? Where it's like now I think this season they're on Mars and The Expanse is like amazing.
Mhm.
But anyway, so this is also structurally clever because it includes women this time around. So it's just kind of bringing to the fore that's like Apollo's twin sister. Women are finally going to the moon. Christina Koch becomes the first woman to fly the lunar distance. And then another like little angle here was that Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, the two directors of Project Hail Mary, were originally fired from Solo, a Star Wars story. So one wonders what would have happened to that movie if they'd still stayed on.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, I would love to see their Star Wars movie. I think it would have
Yeah,
been so much
right.
better. But also, like, there's this phrase that I've heard that, simple times require complex heroes and hard times
Mm,
require simple heroes. And I feel like it's like the perfect demo because like we're probably in like a really hard times right now with
yeah.
everything that's happening. And it's like first with like the new Superman movie, which is
Hmm.
almost like a retro in that sense. It's
Hmm.
also really hopeful, like not a complicated character. Like the character
Hmm.
himself is absolutely pure. It's just like,
Right.
like the things that are happening to him that are more complex. And like Hail Mary sort of like follows the same path here. And
Hmm.
I guess we'll see a lot more of like these movies. Well, until Dune, I guess.
I know, right?
Dune will be different. But yeah, like there's definitely some tone, and we'll see a lot more, I think, movies.
I hope so. Yeah, just on that. I mean, it's the fact that he's a school teacher, right? I mean, obviously he has like degrees. I think it was in molecular biology or something, which is why he was chosen to be at least the bottom string of, the astronauts. But the point is that like, it's a real guy, that's like figuring everything out and, kind of like it reminds me of the Apollo 13 movie, right? Which was like super popular back in the 90s and featured like an actual moon story. Um, so it's like, just hitting on those moments of wanting to be optimistic. So that's one of my lessons for this segment is that optimism is a content strategy and not just a tone. I've kind of been, talking about this a lot because of, what I had labeled the Monsters Inc. strategy of marketing, where it's like we got to get people away from the scare floor, which is like, making them angry, making them, scared, and then using humor or laughter and optimism to get people to like your brand. And I feel like, this is another one of those instances of wanting people to rally behind, a movie and like a space adventure and like science and technology, right? We were talking last week about, tech and AI just having super bad PR right now. And I think this is one of those things that it's like there are ways to get people to enjoy technology and to rally behind it and cheer them on by creating these moments of like success or supposed
Mhm.
success. Hopefully nothing goes wrong tomorrow with the rocket ship launch or out in space when they're out there for 10 days. Another one is that when we have moments of monoculture like this, I think it's great for other brands to kind of jump on. Like here we're seeing IMAX do it, right? Where it's like they're getting a benefit of it, but they're also kind of espousing the points of having an IMAX theater and why it's better, and getting more people like on the side of that. I also see like a lot of artists, directors, actors come out in support of Project Hail Mary because they want the industry to be doing well, and they want companies like Amazon and Apple to be um patrons of the arts and, giving funding to these types of movies and not just, reality TV shows on Netflix.
Ultimately, like the most important lesson here is just like you don't have to be edgy to make you look cool. I think that's like if you look at the sort of like Grace in the movie, he doesn't look cool most of the time actually, but I think he's still like an extremely cool character. So
Yeah.
I like that we're getting sort of like back into this mode for mass culture, and I hope we'll stay here for a while.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Though in this next segment, we'll learn about a company that didn't do so well.
Yeah, so the company I wanted to talk about, and I mean, like half of Twitter is talking about them, it's Delph,
Hmm.
and it's like a 300 million compliance catastrophe. So Delph is a Y Combinator company that is essentially selling compliance automations, whether it's like SOC 2, which is for basically cybersecurity, or like HIPAA compliance for healthcare, or just GDPR for like European like data retention and stuff like this. And if you want to work in like these regions, if you want to work in these industries, or maybe if you want to sell to enterprise companies as a vendor, you need to get such a certificate. And so what happened is like a couple of weeks ago, an anonymous Substack account posted a very extensive post, which is basically claimed that Delph has been generating these fraudulent audit reports for their customers, lying about all the security measures, and fabricating evidence. And like this obviously created an entire avalanche because a whole bunch of tech startups out there have been secured by Delph. They even have this badge on their website because that's sort of like what Delph would provide to you. And there's a reason why all of them went to Delph in the first place, because they promised to do it cheaply, they promised to do it quickly. And of course, like you just want to get a certificate. Your actual goal is to, like grow the company, sell to the client, move on. It's sort of like you just want to get over this hump. But sort of like the problem is that once people no longer trust you, and if you work in like a security or a compliance, it's getting real scary for you, because every claim that you've essentially made, every success story, every marketing activity that you've had, they're now working against you. And like it's like this rare occasion where even like many of their investors are not backing that up, like inside partners who've backed them previously quietly removed the extensive blog post about Delph. And their CEO issued a response, which is probably like it probably would not get in the Hall of Fame of like crisis responses, at least for me, because it basically amounts to two thoughts. First is they didn't do anything wrong, and the second is they will be rebuilding everything inside their company, which I think sort of like doesn't really play well with each other. And
Wait, so then they're not saying that that it's not true.
yeah, because I mean it's hard. They're playing on like technicalities and like just like answering the questions that nobody really asked, while ignoring the sort of like the hard things. While it seems that in the background they're like moving a lot of stuff. They're moving to like a different auditor. But the real problem is that anonymous Substacker, who is basically posing as like a former customer of theirs, a former user, they posted a new post which is detailing even more, including leaked Slack messages, which are, well, they're not great for Delph. if you take a look at them, like TechCrunch has like a copy of the story, and you can just look at the original piece. Like they're extremely bad. They're basically confirms that it wasn't like like a rare omission on their part. It was like something that they were actively pursuing. It's why they chose this specific auditor. And now the problem is that again, all of the signals are now working against them, because I've been in chat with like some founders the chats are mostly for comms, but they're discussing other things in there. And I've seen several of them, like immediately ask, hey, are we actually using Delph? Like imagine this happening across every startup out there just because they saw the news about you. And right now, their own branding is basically collapsing on themselves, because if you work, again, in such a sensitive area as compliance or security, you don't really have this easy way out. Once something happens, people start questioning you immediately. And the worst thing that could happen is like there's this project called LightLM that was breached, and it was secured by Delph sort of like through two of their audits previously. And I mean, audits sometimes miss things. It's natural, actually, but the sequence of these events and how they were spaced in time is just extremely bad for them, because it just confirmed the meme. And now, sort of like if you are thinking about, okay, what company do I need to choose for this? What vendor? It's just hard to imagine that any customer would go to Delph, at least as their first choice.
Yeah, it's funny. We covered Delve on the podcast because they sent out doormats. They wrote a post about it where they were mentioning how they had taken Brex's original like champagne strategy of, sending champagne bottles to companies that had just announced their like I think C to like Series A. A change. So they did a twist on that, which was doing the doormats and saying it was pretty much saying like not for your shoes, but something for your socks too, right? So your sock too. So I was like, oh, it's a clever play on words. So we, talked about it. And then, you start seeing them, come out with like the types of companies that are on there. Cluely was on there. They became like startup darlings where it's like, oh, because of the hype that they got from, tweeting about what they were doing in terms of marketing, that got them more brand name customers. I'm surprised that the, CEO kind of came out with, this non-response to like what is the actual problem of like, hey, can we trust everything that you did? I saw Austin Allred post how a founder had tweeted that like, hey, we're trying to go through like SOC 2 compliance, and then they're like, oh, 24 hours later, oh, Delve did it for us. And like, Austin's like, everyone that's been through the SOC 2 process knows that it doesn't happen that quickly, because it's a huge process of having to go through all your financial like details, which is the whole point of why you want to hire somebody else to do it instead of trying to do it in-house. So there's all these little things that are like coming out now that like make it seem as if it makes sense that this has happened. And I think that's another like PR thing that like people don't really talk about, that like somewhere along the way there are little clues that come out, and when a bigger story comes out that shows that you were doing something wrong, all those things are going to come out and people are going to have those receipts for you, especially on Twitter. I talked about this last week, this whole idea of like retroactive like hate, right? Where it's like people can like you all up until something bad comes out about you, and then all of a sudden they'll go back and like change how they felt about you. So last week's story was that people went had given reviews to a Hachette book, and then they went back to Goodreads and said like, now that I know that she's used AI, I hate this book. And that's what you're showing here, that like the corporate investor. Add this to the another one off the Forbes under 30 list that um has now had some form of wrongdoing.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast of Alex Conrad, formerly from Forbes, who like had very reasonable things. So look, most like there are a bunch of like great people that have been there. Like I mean, Taylor Swift was on Forbes 30 under 30, and sort of like nobody's laughing about this. But right now, every sort of like counterexample that they have is sort of like getting a lot more attention, and it's like it's interesting what they're going to do with like this list. Like I think they might even want to like change something internally, or maybe they would actually want to like ride the meme even further and just like continue doing so.
Yeah, right. Just come out with like this year's class of fraudulent startups.
Yeah, that would be bad. Yeah, so if you get into lessons, like I feel the first one, and I think it's probably the most broadly applied, is that AI powered is not a business model, because part of all of these allegations is that Delve barely had any AI at all. It sort of like was just, like a few basic prompts built on top of like some kind of like AI provider that they had, but they didn't really have these genuine AI workflows that they could have done probably, right, in order to extract this information from your like corporate systems to prepare like the necessary forms and statements and documents. But instead, sort of like what this user claimed is that they basically had to redo everything manually. And we're now at the market where there's just a lot more attention to AI companies. Being an AI company warrants a pretty huge premium on your valuation, on like just everything about you. And there's a huge incentive to claim that you have AI, whether you actually have it or not. And I feel like it's getting a little bit oversaturated at this point. So like people are just, like trying to really sniff it out if you actually have something, how good it actually is. And another part of the problem is that as if you're focusing purely on AI capabilities, then you just end up competing on features. And like next week, there could be somebody else who have slightly better AI features and everybody will just run there. It's sort of like what's been happening with like this leading stage with like state-of-the-art AI models, right? So like, okay, 1 week everybody loves Claude, next week, okay, Codex is better, actually, let's go to Codex, and then sort of like who knows where they will actually go next. The next one, and like we sort of like touched a little bit upon that, is that the brand that promises a shortcut to trust is just the most fragile brand possible, because I'm sure there could have been companies like similar to Delve in sort of like unrelated industries that could have survived this just for the sake of like being like big already, too big to fail. And I think we've seen examples of like such companies really, but the problem is that, yeah, like right now, everything is literally working against them. And any company that switched away from them, it sort of like becomes like yet another stone, right? Or like there's been like discussions like Lovable switch from them. And like, okay, now every big logo leaving you is just like adding to that pressure. So like, if you're building in one of these like very sensitive industries, you have to be extremely careful about how you market yourself, how you promote yourself, and you can never really make any shortcuts. Just because like even like the audience that you have specifically is probably very sensitive to this, and then everybody around you, they will just sort of stop trusting you if they hear about any wrongdoings. And like the final lesson is just, I think a good crisis strategy is always rooted in product and business decisions, and you cannot just post your way out of it if you don't do anything right. And I feel like this is at least allegedly a case where sort of like the company was itself built on pretty fraudulent foundations, and there's just like no way to get out of it, especially again, if we apply the previous lesson as well.
Yeah. My lesson here is the more that, you're out there and like, marketing yourself as like doing these, these things that seem impossible, it's probably because it is. There was always that question in people's minds. And then once this kind of came out, it answered people's questions. So even if it turned out that there wasn't something wrong, the fact that people were like willing to accept it as quickly as they did shows you that there's, something that people were already thinking. And we kind of saw this also with the whole chaperone discourse that happened, right? Where her security guard, frightened a child, and she had to come out and say, oh, I didn't mean for that to happen. That wasn't my security guard and everything. But the point wasn't that this situation happened. It was that she wasn't really given the space to come out and give her side of the story before people already glommed onto the fact that, of course, she would do this because she's previously yelled at paparazzi, All these things like add towards, the brand that you're building, much like, Delve kind of had the brand that they were building. And it gives people, kind of it forms an idea in people's mind that yes, this is totally likely, and that doesn't happen with other brands that like are given a chance to kind of respond or that respond quickly to the crisis. Like, was it Shopify? Yes, Shopify, who had like, Toby had to come out and like, say something, and they, came and like cleared the air almost immediately, right? So these are things that you, as in like, if you have to do crisis PR, are thinking about. It's like, hey, what's coming out? What is it that we need to respond to immediately because it's making us look bad? And then when we respond to it, is it actually a legitimate response to what people are asking, or are we trying to talk around the story, which is kind of like what happened here?
Yeah, it's like a rare case where nobody really came to their defense. Like people might have liked their post, but I haven't seen that even from like some of the people who would expect it from. So
yeah. The VCs were strangely quiet about this whole thing. So moving on to another PR disaster. Sora is dead. OpenAI announced that they're shutting down Sora, the video generation tool that it launched last September. So only about 6 months. The product peaked at about 1 million users after launch, and it was losing roughly $1 million a day. What stands out to me here is Disney didn't hear about it until basically an hour before the public statement was made, which meant that most of Disney and most of like the executives were finding out at the same time that the rest of us were. It's coming out now that Disney executives were shocked that, this was, happening. And so this is, it was supposed to be a $1 billion investment that Disney was making into OpenAI. At the time, we talked about it here and said that it really didn't make sense for Disney. But that was also a decision that was made by Bob Iger, who also left Disney, and now new Disney CEO Josh D'Amaro can, be out there saying that like, well, that was a Bob Iger decision. It's not what I want. Part of what he was saying when he came out as like the new CEO was saying that we're going to focus more on like human creators and not so much like AI. So I think this kind of fits in with what they actually wanted. They also never really made that investment of $1 billion. So it doesn't really seem as if they're like missing out on much. But yeah, Yury, would love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I think the interesting problem with OpenAI is that on one hand, they're like going, like out there building like extremely large data centers, buying all the RAM in the world. And on the
Yeah.
other, they operate like a Series B like startup, like scrappy and like ready to adjust their timeline at any moment. And these two things just don't play together, especially as it applies to comms and policy. Like you need to be a lot more careful about what kind of public statements you make and especially how you communicate with partners. Because if you've been involved in any kind of like announcement with big company, look, all of these stakeholders, they should have been pre-briefed, they should be aligned, because look, Disney is obviously, they're extremely precious about their characters and their IP because it's their main asset. They don't really have much of anything. I mean, yeah, they have parks and they have like Disney Plus and everything, but ultimately what powers all of this is just the IP. And so the fact that they were willing to give it to any AI company, that was a breakthrough. But that's sort of like what made Sora interesting in the first place. And now, yeah, like first of all, they might lock it down forever, or they might go to like a different company. But think about what it means for any other like potential future partner of OpenAI. Like, can you actually trust them on that front? That's a very problematic direction. And another like sort of like what I'm seeing is it's just like, yeah, like they have this internal communications, or like something that Sam is like telling them at all hands meetings, or maybe like sending emails. And I feel like all of these like big tech companies at this point should accept that basically everything that they will issue like company-wide internally will become public. So they should write all of their amendments, keeping in mind that the whole world might be their audience. And it's sort of like, that's why you cannot really sort of like issue like very different statements internally and externally, because yeah, it's pretty clear sort of like why they did it, because obviously it's burning a lot of money, and they don't really have that many users to show for, and they need all of this compute for their like actual like productive models for, again, either productivity or coding. But like you can then just first say this publicly and then wind it out gracefully, because yes, I understand generation might be burning a lot of resources.
Yeah. The thing that actually brought to mind right now, Yuri, with what you were saying, is if they are kind of having those messages internally and sending those like memos, back and forth with like company, there's more of a like chance that those messages will leak before they actually want the messaging to go out. It wouldn't surprise me that he wanted to keep the cards close at hand so that the message wouldn't get out before he actually wanted it to, and have like, a worse reaction to this. Because it is kind of, a pretty big fail on their part that this, huge feature that they launched isn't working and isn't doing that well, which also kind of says a lot about where AI video is to me.
Yeah, for sure.
A couple lessons for me is that the more that you kind of hype something up, the harder the fall down when you have to like close it down, especially since it wasn't that long in between the two. So I definitely think that a lot more people are going to start questioning the next announcement that they make that they say is, as transformative. The other thing is never let a partner find out about the news through a news alert. What's to say that Disney's going to trust them the next time that, OpenAI approaches them? And at some point they're going to want to, right? Because Disney has that IP that they want.
Exactly. And I mean, as any good lawyer would tell you, that if you're about to write anything down or like send an email, imagine a jury reading it. And like the same basically applies to all internal communications. So if you're writing an internal statement, just at a big tech company or like a leading AI lab, just expect people to share it like the media, like publicly, and then just accommodate this in your writing.
That's what happened with Meta, right? It was basically the jury reading internal documents from Meta that led the jury to make the decision that it did. So yes, beware of all, emails and, text, Slack messages and everything that's held internally, because they can be called into any lawsuit in the future.
Okay, like slightly different topic. So I've wrote this State of the Media report 2027. Now with Google, ever since they launched AI overviews, they basically decimated like organic like search traffic, because a lot of people are just satisfied with AI overviews, even though like they're extremely bad at this point, just because it's like a very cheap and a very fast model. And it leads very little to the actual news publishers. Because of that, this, we now have this two-tier structure. We have the big media publications, again, like the New York Times, Bloomberg, WSJ. They have the brands, they have recognition, and that enables them to basically sell a lot of very expensive subscriptions to a lot of people. And so they still have sort of like the capital to both employ writers, but also just like continue growing. And I mean, New York Times is like it's a financial juggernaut at this point, really. And like at the very low end, we have all these like individual like creators who are now essentially rebuilding the media publications that they now left. It's like Eric Newcomer, who like started his own Substack, and now he's hired a bunch of like people, and like he's running events. And like it's a very classic playbook, but he's doing it with like a very different cost structure, and he's able to capture all the upside. The problem is the middle. It's sort of like where a lot of these traditional tech publications, from like The Verge to TechCrunch or like maybe like VentureBeat, they don't yet have the brand or the necessary amount of media subscriptions to produce great content, but they also still have like pretty big like cost structure. They're still struggling. They're trying to adapt. Like a lot of them are launching their own sort of like newsletter for their writers. Part of the problem is that if they create a media personality inside them, they basically give this person a permission to launch their own Substack next, even if they're like they don't have the audience, but just like any kind of like social following they would be able to port there. Some of the best writers are now able to go out there on their own and not just maybe like become a writer, but partner with the media publications like Joanna Stern, a very famous like writer and reporter, and she launched her own publication.
Talk about. She announced like a week or two ago that she's doing her own thing, but under the umbrella of
NBC News. So it's like literally a giant news organization partnering with a creator for like a very specific kind of like niche audience and the content they can produce. And I'm sure she's able to capture a lot more value this way compared to just being a regular writer.
It's probably more interesting for the journalists themselves as well, right? Like where you're kind of still doing your own thing. You're your own business. You don't have somebody telling you what you have to write about, or having legal that will help you in case anything bad happens, right? They have editors that will edit your pieces, and you don't have to do that yourself. So there's like aspects of the business that make it, attractive to kind of partner with these larger media organizations. But then the flip side is you're bringing the audience that you've already built. So it seems like a win-win for both sides. And it wouldn't surprise me to start seeing that happen more and more, especially for the creators that have built up their own audience off, off platform. But yeah, would love to also, switch over to talk about how are you thinking about how you approach, reaching out and pitching to, journalists, whether, the legacy media or, using one of these newer media startups like, Lenny and Newcomer, TBP and upstarts.
Yeah, I feel like the unfortunate truth is that it's just gotten a lot more like complicated and just generally way harder than it was before across the entire spectrum, like The Verge to like TechCrunch. I feel like they've they've raised their bar quite a lot. Like if like maybe like 5 years ago, if you had like a pretty like sizable like funding rounds, like I guess maybe like starting from like 5 million, and if you have like a generally good story, the chances of getting there are pretty high. I wouldn't say this is the truth today. Like first of all, they need to have at least something, but they care a lot more about the story, about what's interesting about your company, about like the founders, like if they have any like pedigree behind them. And then or like these smaller like creator publications, they are like their bar I feel like is even higher, just because they care a lot more about who their guests and who their profiles are. And getting into like one of these publications is probably even more difficult than getting into like, again, TechCrunch or maybe Business Insider right now. So it's definitely like a very difficult time for startups. And it's not like, again, I'm not saying the legacy media is dead. Of course, they're very much alive, especially at the top end. I mean, just a couple of hours ago, Whoop announced their funding round with a New York Times exclusive. And they've been sort of like cited across a whole a series of other media publications. And they didn't just post a tweet. There's a reason why they do this, especially as they're preparing for an IPO. I imagine like sort of like in a couple of years, they need a lot more of like this institutional attention, like high level awareness, just brand recognition and so on. But the question is like what startups can do in all of this, right? And quite often like these days when I'm talking especially to maybe like first time founders who who weren't present or like maybe like 5 or 10 years ago in the tech ecosystem, they don't want TechCrunch, they want TBPN or they want something like this. And again, getting on TBPN is, well, you go and look at the caliber of guests they get each day and sort of like think how difficult that would be. I mean, to their credit, it's like, it's not just about money. It's also just about like very interesting stories, but you need to have this story first. Otherwise, it's just going to be replaced by somebody who's more notable. So what I'm saying a lot to like startups these days is that, first of all, you have to look at the entire spectrum. Because I think what a few publications actually did, like for instance, like Fortune, they now, I think, cover like smaller funding rounds and generally slightly smaller startups. Again, if you're able to tell an interesting story to them. But generally, it's about figuring out, why do you do this in the first place? So if you talk to the media, you need to figure out why. And usually it's, I don't know, like trying to raise awareness among investors, candidates, or potential customers / partners. And each of those tasks can probably be like performed better through other means, whether it's just, like trying to grow your own content and maybe like, like posting accessibly on your own platforms, because like a lot of founders want to be famous, but when you talk to them about why it's important, all of them reply, yeah, I don't have time for this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, in terms of what I'm seeing, what you want to do to kind of put together a pitch is like figuring out what is most interesting about you, right? I feel like a lot of startups aren't really thinking about that in the context of what journalists actually want to write about, right? Like I hear like, oh, well, we raised, X amount. Okay, that's fine. But what does that mean? Like, how do you put it in the context of what their audience wants to learn about? Like, why is it notable that you raised this amount of money? Who did you raise it from? Like, what are you going to be doing with that money? Like, why is it notable that like you raised? Is there like a unique angle to like what you're doing that's not just your pedigree? Because a lot of startups have that nowadays. Whether that's because you worked at a previous startup that was super hot, or you came from a VC or whatever. The other thing to think about is that maybe the raising round isn't the most important thing that you can be talking about, right? Like, are there stats or data that you have internally that's like interesting to like the industry? That you can talk about. Maybe you can go to like trade publications where that matters a lot more because they're actually interested in hearing more about you and the story. And that works twofold because your audience is more likely to be reading those types of publications rather than like a tech publication. Obviously, everybody wants to have a profile written about them because of them raising, but thinking more holistically about the things that you're doing, the things that you're seeing. Oftentimes I'll work with clients that are we'll obviously pitch for like their raises, but tie that to like a customer story of like what they're seeing within the world that they're in, and that oftentimes ends up being like more interesting to the journalist than just the raise itself.
Yeah, and like one thing that I've noticed in many of these tech publications is that even if when they're covering like a fundraise, especially if it's on the smaller scale, they don't even like put it in like the first paragraphs. They sometimes push it until the very end. And it's clear that it was like the original hook that sort of like secured the publication, but it's all about the story of like about why a company actually matters and about what all the interesting things that you're doing. And then, like at the very end, they would say, oh, the company has also raised like 7 million from like these investors and like that's it. So yeah, it's just like you have to really think much deeper about the story and then figure out where you could blend it. And sometimes the answer is like you don't really have a good external option in terms of like earned media. So I guess the lesson for like comms professionals is just to think much wider than this and think about all the channels. Again, sort of like the own channels, they are great. They're really hard to grow at first, but I feel like sort of like fresh founders, they do have this advantage about just like if you're just like post excessively about what you're building and sort of like demos and examples, and of course like different businesses sort of like it's sometimes harder to present what you're building compared to maybe like if you are in some serious sort of like B2B process, but then you can still find a way and sort of like just like to show what you need to show is just the progress that you are making, the pace, because this is what allows people to like vouch for you and like support you. Again, if they believe that you deserve more than you have, they'll be sort of like supporting you until you become like too big and annoying.
Yeah. No, but really, I mean, finding that human element is always going to be more interesting anyway, especially for people that know you and want you to succeed, right? So even like the whole concept of building in public, like it's gotten a bad rap because a lot of it is just very like humble braggy, and people don't like that aspect to it, which is why I suggest that you also talk about the negative stuff that happens. It's not always
Hmm.
just good stuff that's happening all the time, right? I mean, taking it back to the tailwind, right? Like that was,
Hmm.
a negative story that ended up being turned into a positive thing because he came out and was like authentically talking about it. And there's a lot of founders that can talk about that, mistakes that they've made, decisions that didn't turn out quite the way they wanted. I mean, I was just talking to a couple clients last week about this whole idea of like, when do you stop a marketing experiment because you've realized that like, it's not
Hmm.
really converting the way that you wanted to? And I feel like a lot of times companies get stuck in this whole sunk cost process where you feel that because you invested so much time, money, and effort into it, that you have to keep it going. And oftentimes it's better to just shift that, effort into another new marketing experiment in order to see if that is successful. And oftentimes, as soon as you start doing the new thing, you'll get more excited because you're like, oh, this is a new thing. We're trying it out. And it gives it a better shot than something that you've kind of already been plugging away at. That's kind of a little demoralizing because it's not doing as well as you would have hoped. So these are all things that, can be spoken about on Twitter, on LinkedIn. And that's what I think thought leadership should kind of focus on. And that then helps get that interest from journalists because they're like, oh, you have an interesting story that people want to hear about because you're talking about it here. And we're seeing that you're getting that engagement on your own channels.
Yeah, and like one thing that you just mentioned is that like you need to build like this following internally because it serves essentially as a validation for reporters, and this is definitely true because I feel like from like talking to these people, and like we have a couple like former reporters working on our team, is that the dream of a reporter is to basically find your company at this point of the uplift where nobody knew you before except maybe like your customers, and then suddenly everybody knows you, and they
Mhm.
want to be sort of like the first to tell this story. And your goal is to essentially present yourself as a company that's just about to do this, right? That you have all these social like validation around you. Because reporters definitely look at this. I feel like, for instance, like if you remember, like the Arc browser that was like extremely popular until it was like sunset. But I feel like a lot of the attention that it got was because reporters genuinely saw the attention of its users, right? Sort of like all the
Mhm.
interest and like how quickly it was growing and like, like spreading even across sort of like normies, like mainstream users and definitely sort of like not early adopters. So if you're able to build this internally, you will just become more and more interesting to the media and you would be able to
Mhm.
leverage them to propel yourself even further.
Yeah. Agreed.
The first lesson is that, yeah, if you want to work in comms, I feel like just like you need to focus on a lot more than to like just earned media as it used to be. Just because if you limit yourself to earned media, you will have very few clients or you will sort of like struggle to get like too many results for your company if you're in house. Because like right now, when we're sort of like about to announce maybe like, like a major product or maybe like a new funding round, of course, we do want to land some great like media publication and like tech business or like sort of like other relevant sector. But we also think quite a lot about sort of like all the message that will go into it, about all the launch materials, about sort of like blog posts, LinkedIn and expos for the founders, about all the imagery. It's like why all of these startups wanted to do like sort of like launch videos, right? And it's
Mhm.
probably oversaturated in the market a little bit, but the idea is correct, right? You need to sort of like create something that will serve as the artifact for all the other people. It's just like probably at this point, just like doing yet another video probably will not cut it. And
Mhm.
especially if you're like somebody in, like in the US West Coast, it's probably going to be quite expensive for you.
Mhm.
So but there are other things that you could do just in terms of, again, like creating great content that people want to share, that people love to watch. It's about like trying to get anything that attracts attention to your company. And because right now comms is all about owning the story and the distribution and the community, and you need to think about this holistically. And yeah, the
Mhm.
most important notes in terms of the media, I would say, is yeah, like it's either individuals, so like these like smallish creators who have their own individual presence and probably usually like newsletters and podcasts, because they can have an extremely targeted and valuable audience for you. And what's even more important is that they are probably read by all the other reporters that you want to tap into. So
Mhm.
if you're able to get recognized by them, it's going to be very positive for your development in the future. And then there's institutional media, and yeah, sometimes you just might be too early for them, and that's okay. It's just like keep them in your arsenal for the future. Continue thinking about this, maybe like like pinging reporters sometimes with some of your updates and just like learning what they care about. Because if your company grows enough, suddenly they will put a spotlight into you, and you better be ready.
Yeah. A couple things to add on to that is making sure that you're staying on top of industry news and trends, what journalists write about that in that space. Because while they may not want to speak about you specifically, you offering yourself as a source for what's happening in the industry could get you a long way. And then that's kind of how you build up a relationship with a journalist, because they now trust that you know what you're talking about. I've done this with a few clients. Having somebody that can speak to what's happening with their perspective can oftentimes be more valuable to the journalist than just like talking about like your latest funding round. So think about that, like how can you put a unique perspective to everything that's like happening in the news. And then the other thing is, when you're researching journalists to pitch them on, it's not just about you and like the story that you're putting out. It's more about what their audience will be eager to read about, right? Because you have to think about it as like you're marketing your story to their audience. And that's like what journalists are looking for, is like, what is going to make my audience actually click on the link, actually open up the story, engage with it, and talk about it online. Okay, let's move on to takeaways for the Project Hail Mary and space segment. People are looking for good stories, wholesome stories that, kind of speak to human innovation and ingenuity. And I think there's a lot of space for tech companies right now, especially to be trying to fill that void. There's so many tech companies that are building really cool products. And I think even within the media themselves, like the whole idea of having like rage bait and like anti-tech sentiment is starting to hit a wall. So if you have that type of tech company that is building really cool products, start using those stories of like what your customers are doing or what innovations you're creating, and start either posting it yourself on your blog or starting to pitch the media a little bit more, so that we have more of those stories coming out.
I think you already connected these topics, and yeah, sort of like what's common about like Hail Mary and sort of like what's going on in the media is just people really value authenticity, even if they're like sometimes it sort of like it takes it takes a little bit of fakery to get there, because again, like sort of like most founders that I know, they are not really like that vocal. They don't want to like spend their life on Twitter compared to
Yeah.
maybe like some people who can do it organically, right? Or like
Uh-huh.
but it sort of like helps a little bit to like do it strategically, just like spending maybe like 10 15
Mhm.
minutes a day, just like sharing these little bits and pieces about what you're building and doing, because at the end of the day, that just like allows people to like like figure out who you are and just
Mhm.
become a little bit familiar, even if they don't know you yet. They start essentially becoming your cheerleaders in the end, especially if they're able to see this takeoff and sort of like you growing. And I've seen some, like I've been monitoring like some founders who started from the very beginning and just like posting about like their first features, their first users, and sort of like where they're able to get after a couple of years, and it's always exciting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
My takeaway from Delph is just like there are some industries where you really cannot like move fast and break things. Like there are areas where it's just completely unacceptable, especially if you're dealing with enterprise customers, especially if you're dealing with like security or compliance, because as soon as people stop trusting you, your entire business might be ruined. So you have to be extremely careful about this.
Yeah, my takeaway: don't allow yourself to be the villain in terms of like how you're setting yourself up. The reason why this went so viral is because like they were already acting like the villain on Maine, and then this kind of fell into that trap, and it gave people more of an excuse to dislike the company. This is kind of like what we've been talking about with like Cluely, where it's like when you're kind of setting yourself up to be like a villain in the story, people start rooting against you. And this gives them a reason to kind of just jump on, even if they don't understand what's happening or if they haven't even used you like as a service. I think the pile-on ends up being more brand killing. What you mentioned, Yuri, rebuilding trust is so hard. So like, don't screw your customers, over just
Mhm.
because you want to like make the numbers, look good in your favor. And that's also kind of the takeaway from the Sora thing. Burning bridges is not the way that you want to have partnerships going forward. I think if they had kind of been open about what they were going through and why, I mean, it all makes sense, right? The reason why they're canceling Sora makes sense. It's, I don't think that Disney would have been like, no, we got to keep this going, like we want to make $1 billion investment in a part of the company that's failing, So it all
Mhm.
like could have worked out. But I think their desire to be secretive or to not let things get out of, let the cat out of the bag too soon, made them look bad in the end. So sometimes being more transparent and being more open is the way to go so that you invite people into the process of a very savvy business decision without getting them to rail against you because, you overhyped the launch in the first place.
Exactly. And I feel like if we're getting like into like Sora and everything because it's sort of like related in terms of just the negativity,
Hmm.
the main rule of communication is that just like look, dance like everybody's watching because anything
Yeah.
that you communicate, even internally, it's going to get public, and
Yeah.
you always have to communicate with that assumption in mind. Maybe like not right now because look, you don't have 3,000 employees, but it could be like a legal discovery like 7 years into the future and like just like ask Meta how that's going for them. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's funny because I think the story ended up being more about what they did wrong in terms of the announcement versus the actual announcement itself. But we'll never know, right? Because they went about it the way that they went.
yeah, and if we're talking about like there's the overall state of the media, the real takeaway of all of this is it's just going to get even harder for like comms
Mhm.
people, for like tech companies who want to get attention, who want to get coverage. Attention is like the only finite thing that we will probably have in a couple of years, as
Mhm.
or at least like it seems this way. So like everybody will be able to build product, but not everybody will be able to get attention for it. So the only way to work with this is just like looking much wider at the entire spectrum available to you, starting in like internally with essentially what's basically called own media, just like writing your own blog posts, LinkedIn, Twitter accounts, and so on. And like we've seen a lot more companies, I think, doing this way, even when they sort of like have a news event that could go into the media in the first place, just like announce their fundraise on their blog and just maybe like, oh, be glad if anybody covers this. I still think we probably should evaluate all of your chances, but just, like limiting yourself to earned media is definitely not an option anymore.
Yeah, agree. Basically, make your own news, and then the news will come to you because they're so interested in like hearing about your story. One of the main reasons why you want to build in public so that you're creating that channel and building that channel up for yourselves already. And then once you get the earned media, you can then promote it a little bit more on your own channel. So it should all just kind of be feeding off each other in order to grow your entire brand and go from there. But you have to be doing the work of like figuring out where your company fits in to the mediascape and the what's trending, what's not, and then finding different stories that might be more interesting or more relevant to journalists than just your raise, which oftentimes really isn't really that interesting anymore for journalists. So thank you for coming on, Yury. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I think the best option is just my blog at molodtsov.me, and you can get to all of the other places from there. And yeah, thank you for having me again.
Yeah, definitely. And then you can follow me at Sonia Baschez everywhere, and then the podcast at Meme Team Pod on YouTube, and then Meme Team Podcast on Spotify and TikTok. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.